Welcome to this presentation about Walt Whitman. This informal presentation has relied on very many resources not formally nor extensively researched. It is our hope that most of this information is accurate. Volumes have been written about Walt Whitman, his life, his poetry, his philosophy, and his influence on his contemporaries, but also as he still influences our lives today. It is this confluence of his poetry and art that is the focus of this presentation. Join us as his words and the works of those artists come together. Whitman asserted that art was seen in one's sensitivity to moral beauty. He said such men and women are not merely artists, they are the artistic material itself. Whitman was deeply intertwined with the art world during his life, and after several years of backlash for his unconventional style, his poetry became a major influence for artists. He claimed that all men contain something of the artist in them. Walt Whitman was born in West Hills, Long Island, on May 31, 1819. His early years were spent in Brooklyn, New York, and on Long Island. Although he left formal schooling at age 11, he worked as a printer, a teacher, and a journalist, and began publishing his own newspaper. He also wrote poetry and fiction, and published his first collection of poetry, Leaves of Grass, in 1855, using his own money. He continued to expand and revise Leaves of Grass until his death in 1892. During Whitman's lifetime, it went through 9 different editings, each with its own distinct virtues and faults. Whitman compared the finished book to a cathedral long under construction, and on another occasion to a tree with its cumulative rings of growth. He was around 42 years of age when the Civil War broke out in 1861. Fearing his brother had been killed, Walt Whitman left New York and traveled down south on foot to make sure his brother was still alive. He was. But the journey changed Walt Whitman forever. He was struck at the sheer devastation and damage that had been done to the soldiers, both physically and mentally. He did not return to New York, but rather he began to volunteer as a nurse in nearby Washington, D.C. Supporting himself by taking government positions, Walt Whitman made hospital visits to thousands of Civil War soldiers. He cared for their wounded and ill bodies. He sustained their morale with small gifts, attentiveness, and affection, and he regularly urged them to communicate with their families. Stating that he celebrated democracy, nature, love, and friendship, his monumental work, Leaves of Grass, chanted praises to the body as well as to the soul, and found beauty and reassurance even in death. Whitman was known for his general and nonconforming gambits of eccentric behavior. He characterized himself as an individual molded by exposure to the landscape and the culture of Long Island and from 8,000 miles of travel across America. He is often called the father of free verse for his innovative style that broke away from European structures and British influence poetry. The Poetry Foundation credits Walt Whitman as America's world poet, a latter-day successor to Homer, Virgil, Dante, and Shakespeare. Leaves of Grass contained controversial subject matter for which it was censored due to sensuality, but it also incorporated both transcendentalism and realism. Though little appreciated upon its appearance, Leaves of Grass was warmly praised by the poet and essayist Ralph Waldo Emerson, who was also a central figure in the 19th century American transcendentalist movement. Upon receiving the poems, Emerson wrote to Whitman that it was the most extraordinary piece of wit and wisdom America had yet contributed. It was said that Leaves of Grass was egotistical, But for Whitman, the proof of a poet is that his country absorbs him as affectionately as he has absorbed it. It is said that inventor and painter Samuel Morse described Walt Whitman's genius as the grandest revelation of his life and a lesson of artistic expression, saying that Whitman's genius was subtle and powerful, something special in the individual. Even prior to the publication of the first edition of Leaves of Grass, Walt Whitman was a huge and public supporter of the arts. He valued his friendship with fellow poet William Cullen Bryant, who is one of the figures in Asher B. Duran's Kindred Spirits, and who introduced him to a number of Hudson River School artists and artists of the American Art Union. Walt Whitman passionately involved himself in New York's growing art scenes during the mid-1800s as an advocate for the important impact of art on democracy. Asked how did mid-19th century artists integrate art into the fabric of a demographic and widely diverse society, Whitman responded, "Simplicity and boldness of expression, direct contemplation of nature." For Walt Whitman, the poetic quality is not marshaled in rhyme or uniformity. "Art is the soul," he exclaimed. The Hudson River School, like Whitman, was relevant and active during the early to mid-1800s. Their work was concerned with presenting the natural wonders of North America. Such works as Thomas Cole's The Oxbow and Alfred Bierstadt's Among the Sierra Nevada and others presented a world that most of America had not seen. Both Whitman and the painters of the Hudson River School shared a similar sense of awe, wonder, and fear of the unknown. And in the case for painters such as Thomas Moran, it was also the fear and majesty of the unknown power and mystique of the natural wonders in America. Whitman's poetry, a most jubilant songline, inspired writers and artists about the wonderful world around us. Whitman found form for his thoughts in the objects of nature. While his poems advocated a doctrine of individualism, they also promoted the ideas of companionship and brotherhood. The writer and naturalist active in the conservation movement, John Burroughs called Whitman's poetry one-line genre paintings, every line a picture. He wrote Walt Whitman as poet and person in 1871, the first book written about Walt Whitman. Whitman became, in Burroughs' mind, the ultimate model individual, the embodiment of the Emersonian ideal of an unapologetic, self-defined man. Whitman praised Thomas Aiken's personality and paintings for pushing against politeness to depict plain truth. This trait that Whitman admired in Aiken's is mirrored in Whitman's Poetics, which ignored expectations for steady meter and rhyme. Thomas Aiken's created photography and paintings of Walt Whitman that are thought today to comprise the most representational images of the true Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman worked to capture the vividness of visual art in language. While Whitman said of Thomas Aiken's, "I never knew but one artist, and that's Tom Aikens, who could resist the temptation to see what they thought ought to be, rather than what is." The sculptor William O'Donovan, who created a bust of Walt Whitman in 1893, was a close friend of Whitman's. He viewed Walt Whitman as a man of the people, simple, unschooled, garbed, passionate, and spontaneous. Some also referred to him as the American poet-prophet. After Walt Whitman's poems were published, their deviation from traditional forms, passion for honesty, exploration of the full spectrum of the human experience, and dedication to individualism influenced entire art movements. Poet Adolf Wolff in 1913 hailed Whitman's verse as a clarion call to freedom, a gesture of revolt, a declaration of the right of all to live, and to love, and to dare, and to do. Walt Whitman advocated for a young artist race, ardent, radical, and progressive, worthy of the new American Republic and this greatest of all ages. He affected painters of the American modernist style, such as Georgia O'Keeffe and her Lake George reflection. Georgia O'Keeffe idolized Walt Whitman. It is sometimes said that her art is described as structural, layered, and faceted, like abstract sonnets, not marshaled in rhyme or uniformity, or, as Whitman would say, art is in the soul. Walt Whitman kept alive what Robert Henri called the art spirit. Henri imagined his own mind as a gallery lined with luminous images, or, as Walt Whitman would say, snapshots of the physical reality, such as landscapes, demographics, and portraits of common people. Poetry has strong visual qualities that appeal to Walt Whitman, and he felt that visual art represented the same intangible ethic. As Marsden Hartley developed as an artist, he would often refer to Whitman's writings as a guide to understanding himself and nature. Hartley's 1905 painting, Walt Whitman's House, is a tribute to Walt Whitman. And his landscape paintings, including his 1908 Hall of the Mountain King, were a point of ecstatic spiritual connection between the individual and the universal, much like Whitman's poetry. Whitman's scholar, Noel Frackman, noted that Walt Whitman blended notions of spirituality, liberation of the soul, the soaring of creative imagination, and the very soul of the United States. An artist, Stuart Davis, was also influenced by Walt Whitman's poetry and the ideas about America. Davis's work often reflected Whitman's enthusiasm for the country and his belief that art should bring joy. Stuart Davis drew from the sonic landscape of jazz for his paintings, similar to Whitman's own attention to the sounds of America in his poetry, I Hear America Singing. Inspired by Whitman's rejection of convention, Joseph Stella, in his 1929 work Red Flower, dedicated himself to craft a new visual language to depict his individual emotions. As writer Ruth L. Bohan stated, both painter and poet convey the dynamic aspects of fragmented forms, pulsating colors, and dramatic contrasts of light and dark. In addition, Walt Whitman influenced architect Frank Lloyd Wright, who used architecture to connect individuals to each other and to nature, similar to Whitman's use of poetry. Wright called Whitman a seer of democracy, explaining that the terms of democratic salvation may only be found deep within man himself by his comprehension of the basic principles of nature and of his own human nature. But he feels it, he has it in his soul, and it can't be taken away from him, no matter what happens. After suffering a stroke, Walt Whitman moved to Camden, New Jersey, where his health further declined. When he died on his birthday at age 72 in 1889, his funeral was a public event. In conclusion, biographer and psychiatrist Richard Buck described Whitman's poetry as specifically the Song of Myself, as not only a celebration of man, any man, his soul and body, but as a celebration of everything else as well, objects gross and the unseen as well, the earth and soul and all there is upon it, as well as the universe and the divine spirit that animates it. That is it. Whitman's influence on poetry remains strong today. Art historian Mary Berenson wrote, "You cannot really understand America without Walt Whitman, without Leaves of Grass." And modernist poet Ezra Pound called Whitman America's poet. He is America.